This is North Korea. It's one of the most brutal dictatorships on earth, where average incomes are just $3 a day, where forced labour camps still operate, and where simply criticising the regime can get you and your entire family sent to a prison camp for life. And this is South Korea, one of the richest and most developed countries in Asia, with the third highest life expectancy in the world. 80 years ago they were the same country, before being torn apart by a brutal civil war. And since then they've been on totally different paths, just not in the way that you might expect. Despite witnessing one of the greatest economic success stories in history, South Korea is on track to go extinct. They have the lowest fertility rate in the world, and by the turn of the next century, their population is set to shrink to just 22 million people. And yet, despite living in a brutal dictatorship with none of the freedoms or luxuries of their southern neighbours, North Korea actually has a significantly higher birth rate than the South. This isn't just something that's happening on this peninsula. Across pretty much every country in the world, birth rates are rapidly falling, and yet nobody really knows why, or what, if anything, we can do about it. But the more we look at these two bizarre countries, the more it unravels the mystery of why people across the world have given up on having kids, and what can be really done to fix it. This is why people in the world's worst dictatorship are having more kids than one of the richest countries on earth. So even using the most pessimistic estimates, the country's fertility rate is likely to be around double that of their southern neighbours. Okay, so what's actually going on here? The first and most obvious explanation is it's simply a consequence of a country getting richer. The theory goes that as a country develops, more and more people pile into cities, chasing higher payer jobs, demand for urban land explodes, and house prices spiral upwards. Before long, the prospect of buying somewhere big enough to actually raise a family becomes basically impossible, so people just don't have kids. And so because North Korea is poor, this effect just hasn't happened, and they've got higher fertility rates. Now, in theory, if this issue is purely financial, then for a country like South Korea, it's also pretty easy to solve. Whenever a family is going to have another kid, promise to give them a certain amount every year to offset the costs of things like childcare, school fees, and crucially, needing a bigger home. The problem is, that's exactly what South Korea has spent the last 2 decades doing. It just hasn't worked. In 2024, construction giant Boo Young announced that they'd start paying every single one of their employees 100 million won, or roughly $58,000 for every new child they had. To put that into perspective, it's more than the average annual salary in South Korea. And the result? It increased the annual number of births at that company by a grand total of 8. This isn't some niche scheme either. Over the past 2 decades, the South Korean government has spent around $300 billion trying to convince people to have kids, roughly the entire GDP of Finland. They've tried pretty much everything you could imagine, from cash handouts worth $20,000 for every newborn, to housing loans for young couples, to even running government-funded matchmaking events. The thing is, none of it has made any real difference. Studies analysing data from 250 local governments found that almost all of those policies had no meaningful impact on the birth rate. And that also matches what we're seeing across the world today. Many of the poorest countries in the world, places like Bangladesh, Nepal and Vietnam, are actually experiencing some of the fastest rates of fertility decline. And at the same time, countries like America seem to be surprisingly resistant to fertility decline, at least compared to most other countries in Europe, despite the fact that they're a lot richer. So while the financial side of things might play some role in the gap between North and South Korea, there's clearly a lot more going on here.
Marathon of more than 9 hours of exams.
It's something that could have lasting repercussions on the students for the rest of their lives.
It's just ongoing and never ending, and I studied more and more, but I never felt it's enough.
The College Scholastic Ability Test, also known as the Senyoung, is a brutal 10-hour-long South Korean exam, which effectively goes on to determine the rest of your life. That's because the score that you get decides which university you go to, and at the very top of that hierarchy sits these. Collectively, they're known as the Sky, and they serve basically as the gateway into the country's political and corporate elite. Despite only around 2% of South Korean students ever getting into these universities, that 2% goes on to fill nearly half of the country's top CEO positions, nearly half of its senior government roles, and the vast majority of its senior judiciary. So as you might expect, actually getting into these universities has become something of an academic arms race. As early as just 5 years old, children will begin attending what is known as a hagwon, It's effectively a private cram school that runs from when their main school day finishes right through to around 10 PM at night, drilling them on maths, English, Korean, and science, all geared toward preparing them for the Senyuan. The top tutors are known as Ilta, meaning number one. Hyun Woo-jin is a Stanford-trained maths tutor and is reported to earn around $15 million a year, making him richer than most of the country's top athletes. Safe to say, it's an insanely intense system. The problem is, when every family is doing this, the bar just keeps rising. First, it's just an extra hour or two of prep after school. Then it's a hagwon from the start of middle school, and eventually you end up where we are today, where the average household spends close to a fifth of its disposable income just on out-of-school tuition. That means that every parent is basically forced to pour an insane amount of time and money into each individual child, to the point where if they were to have a second or third, they'd effectively be denying each of them at a real shot of making it in life. By the 1980s, the government had realised how damaging this was, so they actually tried to ban it, labelling private tutoring as a social evil. But this actually ended up just forcing private tutors underground, meaning only the most privileged families could afford it. So after a couple of decades, they gave up on the ban. In Seoul today, every hagwon is legally required to shut by 10 PM, but schools will often get around this by switching the lights off and teaching in the dark. All this means if young South Koreans get married, they'll often decide to avoid the whole ordeal altogether and simply not have kids at all. Even those who do rarely go beyond one. Just 1 in 14 babies born in South Korea today is a third child or later. On top of that, this system also means that young people end up spending their 20s and early 30s grinding through degrees, exams, and brutal office hours, which leaves them with very little time to actually start a family. And while South Korea might seem like a fairly dystopian example of this, similar things are happening all over the world. In places like the UK, the number of people getting undergraduate degrees has skyrocketed. Not necessarily because the economy needs more people with degrees, but because without one, it's become basically impossible to get a job. It's an effect known as elite overproduction. When a country starts minting more highly credentialed young people than there are top jobs to absorb them. It then means that if graduates want to make their CV stand out, they need to go even further, getting a master's degree or even a PhD. And you've got stories coming out of people with top degrees from elite universities ending up pretty much jobless because those degrees just aren't worth what they used to be anymore. But in some ways, this is just the inevitable consequence of meritocracy. Once a country starts handing out the best jobs based on grades and credentials rather than family connections, your CV becomes the single most important thing, standing between you and a comfortable life. And so everyone chases better grades, better universities, longer hours, and just like the hagwon in Korea, the bar just keeps rising. The more competitive it gets, the more time and money each child needs from their parents just to keep up, making the thought of having a second or third child basically impossible. On the other hand, countries like North Korea have managed to avoid this issue altogether for the simple reason that they never adopted meritocracy. This is Kim Il-sung University, basically North Korea's equivalent to the sky, and admission to it is practically a requirement if you want any shot at the country's political or military elite. But rather than being decided by how you perform in an exam, it comes down to something known as songbun. It's essentially a hereditary social class assigned to every single citizen at birth, based entirely on how loyal your father's family was during and after the Korean War. What this means in practice is that no matter how clever or hardworking you are, where you end up in life is decided almost entirely before you're even born. Children from hostile families, meanwhile, aren't even allowed to attend school in Pyongyang. And on the rare occasion that a low songbun child does manage to outperform a higher ranking classmate, the system simply steps in and deliberately diminishes their grades. According to someone who escaped North Korea, children who thought that they might have poor songbun would not even bother to study hard, to practice their musical instruments, or even compete in sport, because they know full well that they're already barred from the best schools and the best jobs. As unfair as that system clearly is, it does have one unintended consequence. It makes having children a lot more appealing. Because there's so little a parent can do to improve their child's social standing, there's no real incentive to pour everything into a single kid. You might as well just have several. In fact, in a country as poor as North Korea, kids actually become something of an asset. From an early age, they can pitch in around the house, work the family plot, or earn a bit of money on the side. And in a society with no real pension scheme to speak of, they're also pretty much the only real retirement insurance you've got. In a strange way, it seems that a more competitive education system, i.e. one of the few things that everybody would agree is good for society, might make maintaining a stable population almost impossible. This effect actually tracks for pretty much every other country in the world. As the average number of years in school increases, total fertility rates go down. Unsurprisingly, the countries with the lowest fertility rates, places like Taiwan, Singapore, and of course South Korea, are all renowned for having some of the most challenging education systems in the world. Okay, so there's no question that the gap in education systems is playing a big role in why South Korea's fertility rates are so much lower than North Korea's. But it still doesn't answer everything. Take a look at this. Each line represents the percentage of people who are married by different ages across generations. And it shows that since the 1980s, South Koreans have consistently been getting married later and later, if they even get married at all. And in a country where roughly 94% of all births still happen within marriage, fewer and later weddings translate almost directly into fewer babies. But it's unlikely that the education arms race alone would explain this. After all, the fact that it's pushed up the time and money spent on each individual child wouldn't necessarily stop people from getting married in the first place. Of course, part of this is likely just that young people get so consumed by climbing the career ladder in their 20s that by the time they finally come up for air, the window to settle down has more or less closed. But there's also something else going on entirely here. In June 2025, South Korea held a presidential election which came down to three main candidates: Lee Jae-myung on the progressive left, Kim Moon-soo of the Conservative People Power Party, and crucially, Lee Jun-seok of the further right Reform Party. He'd made his name attacking feminist groups, calling for harsher penalties for forced rape, and even comparing radical feminism to terrorism. By the end of the campaign, both right-wing candidates have promised to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality. So perhaps unsurprisingly, together they won the support of 74% of men in their 20s, while only getting 36% of women. Now, when it comes to matchmaking, that actually creates a pretty serious problem. If we assume that, say, 80% of South Koreans wouldn't be willing to marry somebody who voted for the opposite side, that leaves at least 30% of the population shut out of the marriage market entirely. Similar to the educational arms race, this isn't a problem that's unique to Korea, but rather the country that seems to be getting a bit ahead of the curve. Over the past few years, a wide gap between political ideologies of young women and young men has begun to emerge across the Western world, with women typically drifting further to the left and men going further to the right. A big part of the reason for this, unsurprisingly, is social media. Young men and women are now being fed completely different content, drifting into echo chambers that increasingly don't overlap at all. Of course, in North Korea, this isn't really a problem. With no access to social media and state-controlled media being the only alternative, there simply isn't the infrastructure for these kind of echo chambers to form. On top of driving political polarization, access to social media likely makes people just a lot less willing to settle down in general. Part of this is the dating app effect. Rather than helping people find a match and commit, apps may actually increase what economists call the option value, the sense that there's always someone better to swipe away, which pushes marriage rates down further rather than up. On top of that, social media is simply replacing the time people used to spend together in person. Young people today spend dramatically less time hanging out face to face than previous generations did, and a lot more time alone in front of a screen. A recent paper actually directly tested the significance of the smartphone effect on fertility. Because the iPhone launched exclusively on AT&T from 2007 to 2011, researchers could compare fertility trends in similar areas with early smartphone access against those without. What they found was that 30 to 52% of the entire decline in US fertility over that period was due to smartphone access. In some ways, the gap between North and South Korea is just an extreme version of a pattern you can see playing out everywhere. As countries become more educated and more connected, they seem to quietly shed the conditions that made having children feel natural or even necessary. In North Korea, kids are still an economic asset. There's no hagwon arms race eating up your time, no social media pulling couples into separate ideological universes, and no smartphone replacing the hours people used to spend actually together. South Korea, meanwhile, has built one of the most impressive societies in human history, but in doing so has made having a family feel increasingly like an irrational decision. The honest truth is that nobody has really cracked this yet. South Korea has thrown hundreds of billions of dollars at the problem and barely moved the needle. And it's not alone. Fertility is falling in almost every country on Earth, rich and poor alike, and the policies that are supposed to fix it largely don't work. There are also things we haven't even had time to get into. Female empowerment and access to contraception being the most obvious, both of which almost certainly play a significant role in their own right. With all of that said, it's worth taking a big step back. 50 years ago, the books people were writing weren't about population collapse, they were about overpopulation. Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, published in 1968, predicted mass starvation and a societal breakdown as the world's population spiraled out of control. And now we seem to be facing the opposite challenge. But there is a real chance that, just like the overpopulation problem, the right solution is, well, to do nothing. If you were to look at the countries which acted most aggressively to curb issues around overpopulation, like China, they're now paying a massive price for what turned out to be a policy going completely in the wrong direction, which perhaps suggests that when it comes to fertility, governments are just not very good at being in control of the outcome either way. Of course, whether birth rates will actually stabilise without governments getting involved, only time will tell.